When we first moved in here, I made Mrs. Rotary a nice office desk by laminating a whole bunch of these strips of wood together. It was a bunch of work, but my mate Anton helped me.
Can you please make me a side cabinet?
Now my mate's complained that, hey, this is not a woodworking channel, and while he's right, I'm about 1 year behind schedule on this one honeydew. I need to make this sort of side cabinet thing for my wife's office, so you gotta do what you gotta do. When I moved in here, all of the upstairs rooms had this like tongue and groove wood paneling up on the ceiling. I took it all down because it was a dumb idea. There was a lot of mold behind it. Anyway, I laminated up a whole bunch of it and made a nice table for Mrs. Rotary for her office. Now it's time to make the matching side cabinet. This is going to be a fair bit of work. I first need to cut them roughly to length with a bit extra. Then I need to cut the tongue and groove off both sides. And finally, these aren't parallel, they're slightly tapered. So I need to put them through the thicknesser and make them parallel. And only then I can epoxy them all into a slab and continue building from there. So that's all the tongues, which I cut off, leaving this pile of good wood. Next up, they all go through the thicknesser. My mate Phil lent me his little thicknesser, which is useful. Unfortunately, when I did a test cut, I'm getting pretty nasty grooves in here. So Phil, onto the blackboard and write 100 times, I will not plane aluminium. I will not plane aluminium. Now to sharpen it, I'm going to need 45-degree angles. So the saw does 45. These are just some strips of old sheet metal, just to lock the blades in place. So here's my surface plate. I'll just blue this up and see whether the angle's anywhere near accurate. So the angle's not quite perfect, but then again, the blade's far from perfect as it is, so I'm definitely going to improve it with this grind. Because the blade's so damaged, I'll start off with 180 grit paper. Do you use the same method to sharpen your planer blades? I looked at doing it on the Clarkson, but it doesn't have this much travel. Unfortunately, those nicks were so deep that I've run out of sandpaper before I could get them out completely, but let's see if they cut better anyway. Well, it's still not perfect, but it's better. These strips are very flexible, so when I laminate them, to prevent a big curve, I'll try clamping them between two straight edges. I mean, the straight edges are also somewhat flexible, but let's see if it helps a bit. This is a laminating resin, so it's pretty slow drying. After a bunch of passes through the thickness there, it's looking like this. There are a few bits with a bit of tear out. I'm going to have to put them on the bottom. But the other side's looking quite nice. So now that I've laminated up some pieces, I next have to join them together. For this, my mate Norbert lent me his biscuit router. I'm going to put some of these in. When you start building wooden aircraft, one of the problems you've got is that wood, being natural, is not really homogeneous in its material properties. Unlike aluminium or steel, where at least per batch you can get pretty exacting material properties, wood, well, the way it grows is not that repeatable. And you do find there's a big difference in the way wooden aircraft are built in Europe to the States. In America, you grow all the structural members like spars and longerons, etc., out of old growth Sitka spruce. As natural products go, those old growth 400-year-old plus trees are pretty homogeneous. So a lot of studies were done back in the 30s and 40s to determine the acceptable material properties of that wood. So if the wood you use has consistent growth rings, you don't have to analyze its strength. You can just go off number and straightness of growth rings and use that as an equivalent of strength. In Europe, by the time planes came around, the old growth forests were mostly gone. They couldn't really use that same methodology. One of the ways wood was made more consistent for structural aircraft parts was to use a process called TIBO. And basically TIBO is just 3mm or 1/8" strips of beech wood which are laminated together, and in that way you can homogenize the material properties of the beech. It's quite clear this doesn't reach anything like the strength to weight ratio of old growth spruce, but you got to use what you've got, you know, so that was the solution they came up with. The top's now too big to go through the planer, and I've finished the laminating, so let's just clean it up a bit with the hand plane. This is the lower surface, so it doesn't have to be perfect. So now that the top is made, next thing, I've marked out the timber that needs to be cut to form the legs. Now to cut them nice and square, I've broken out my crosscut sledge. It just runs on the side of the table. Did you see that the James Webb Space Telescope has now completed its transformer phase? Fantastic. Now they just got to make sure they don't push it too far, because if it gets pushed with too much energy, it'll go past the L2 Lagrange point and fly off into space, never to be seen again. That would suck. Now the glue is dried on those legs. I'll run them through the jointer to clean them up before I stick them together into assemblies. Quick sand and then they'll be ready for putting together. This one got quite a bit of chip out, unfortunately. I tried from both directions but didn't really want to cut that nicely. Alright, it's time to cut off the outside of these legs. I had a bit of a mistake with the saw on that last cut, but luckily that's the bottom down to the floor. So there's just going to be some sort of a pad put on there before it sits on the floor, so that doesn't matter. That was lucky. Right, with the table and legs prepped, next thing I'm going to need is to make up the boxes for the shelves and drawers. Now I'm going to venture that the way I'm about to do this is pretty close to the worst possible way of going about it. Because I made that dumb mistake of not putting in a rabbet, you got to live with the consequences. Well, it's nicely square. Note to myself, next time I try doing something like this, design in a rabbet. It will be way easier. Well, it's been a bit of a slow process, only having 3 big clamps, but I've got all of these L-shaped pieces made, and now I can start putting them together to make boxes. Once again, I've just clamped some guide pieces to make it easier to fixture. Having MDF professionally cut on one of those big industrial panel saws is fantastic. It's not just the size is super accurate, but also these angles are so beautifully cut 90 degrees. It makes the fit up super easy as well. Well, it's the next day. As you can see, I clamped a square to square it up as it dried. Right, first box done, and I won't bore you with doing the same thing on the second. Next up, I need to install the legs, and for that, I've made up these little brackets. They're just a bolt welded to a bracket. I need to just make a recess here for this to sit down into. These plates are then going to get screwed and epoxied into the recess. I just made up a little mill guide here. Years ago for the router I made this little guide bushing there. Right, with the top and the legs joined, I could offer up the boxes and also put on the lower plate, which makes one of the shelves. I think I'll use dowels to put the shelf in. Right, now it's all glued up and I've bogged the front edges. I guess I can start sealing it. You have to do this because MDF just basically drinks up paint. So if you don't seal it first, you can just keep putting on layer after layer of paint and it just keeps disappearing into the MDF and not really getting glossy or getting finished. Right, well, flipped over, ready for its second coat of undercoat. Well, I finished the painting. I didn't bother filming all that because that just gets boring. I got these draw slides, junkers, soft closing. So it's time to install them. I've already installed the first row here. I just spaced them up off the bottom with this 10mm wood. Get them nice and even. To set up the draw rails nice and parallel, I'm just using this 10cm piece of old board as a spacer. I'm using these like special panel screw, particle board screws. Sort of like what you'd make IKEA furniture out of, I guess. Right, it's now time to assemble it and get those legs on. I'll need to put a few screws in it to hold the major assemblies together. Now at some stage after I thought I'd finished the top, I decided that the front wasn't smooth enough, so I sanded it again. So it needs a bit more shellac on it. Now the last part of this build is making a set of drawers. Do you also have a setup like this at the local hardware store where you can just order wood and they'll cut it to whatever dimensions you like? They cut it pretty accurately, normally easily within 1mm, more like less than 1/2 mm. So these are the fronts, don't need them yet. Sides go like that. And I need to put a rabbet in the end of each of these ones, in both ends. So I'll just put all the other bits away, just in case I rabbet the wrong piece. Having done Eurobox storage on the wall in this room, I'm kind of wondering whether I should do some Eurobox storage for here under this bench as well, because some might consider this a tad messy. Right, here's my setup for doing the rabbet. Oh, it's a bit too deep, but the depth's pretty near perfect. Right, I'll glue up one, see what it looks like. And finally the last one. These are the drawer fronts. I use Bondo or Bog just to seal the edges, give them a quick sanding. Now before painting starts, I'll just seal the wood, just shellac. Not much more to go now. Just give that undercoating a bit of a clean up and final coat. I of course tried to convince Mrs. Rotary that the appropriate colour to paint everything is RAL 6011 Reseda Green, but she had different ideas. So it's some blue colour. It's cool. Right, time for the final install. And there we have it, one completely finished side cabinet.
Thanks, that looks really cool, and I hope my office will be less messy now.
It's been a really fun project. It took an awful lot longer than I expected, and was a lot more work than I expected it to be. Especially these drawers and cabinets took a lot longer than expected, but there was a lot of waiting for paint to dry. Thanks a lot for watching, and let's get back to our usual engineering subjects.